So, so I think that, and there are still millions of us, millions of New Yorkers who still think about it every day, who still deal with the mental and physical repercussions of it, even as it does move into history, and even as young people grow up in a time not knowing, not ever having seen the towers standing. So it's a life-changing moment, and I think it's really interesting thinking about how to handle those kinds of events and moments in literature. How do we do that? What do we do with our memories of events like that? Where do we put those stories? And what do you do with grief that is ongoing and that's sort of in the fabric of your life? I think that's a big part of Gigi's story, is walking with grief in her life. And no matter where that grief comes from, how do we handle it as people? Because it's not just, it's an ever-present thing. It's not just a one-time event. So tonight I'm going to talk to you a bit about my personal experience of 9/11, and then how I came to write that part of the book. Then sort of my writing process in general and what I hope people have gotten out of it. And please do ask me any questions as we go along. So as you know, it's the story of Gigi Stanislavski. She's a New Yorker living in London, and she walks out on her family, leaving them on the doorstep. She's had a breakdown. She's wearing her bathrobe and her flip-flops, wandering the streets of South London. She's overwhelmed by motherhood. She's got challenges in her marriage, and she's carrying this ongoing grief. And we sit with her in that hotel room as she watches reality TV and she thinks about her life. And it's very clear there where we can see the connection between her grief from her past and how that connects to her postpartum depression after the birth of her new baby. I hope that readers also feel that it's the story of how she makes her way back from there. And I hope that people notice how she uses humor to do that, because I think humor and grief are often just different ends of the same line. Because her story is about not going back to the woman who she was before, but evolving into and accepting the woman that she is now because of everything that she survived. And she did survive a lot. And I hope that readers come away feeling that she has found some of the lightness in the dark, even though parts of her story can be really dark and can be really heavy. So the book opens, that first chapter, Ash, it opens with her experience of 9/11, escaping from the collapsed towers and getting to the Staten Island ferry, going back to her parents' home. And one of the things I wanted to explore when I wrote about 9/11 was that feeling of, it was so surreal, and I think her parents really demonstrate that, of seeing a catastrophe of that enormity unfolding in front of you, and human beings not knowing, can't get their head around how huge it is, and so they fall back into routines as though it's not happening. So even though they could see it from their window, and even though it was on repeat on the television, they're making sandwiches and doing laundry and playing cards and having this really surreal experience. And I think that happened to a lot of people that day. Millions of New Yorkers sort of stopped short. They could see the tragedy in front of them, and we were all so powerless to do anything. So I wanted to capture that kind of moment of, what do you think actually happens in a catastrophe? It's quite different to what actually does happen when you're in one. Of course, then she finds out that her brother Frankie was in the towers, and the whole family realizes that he won't be coming home. I'm often asked how much of the book is fiction and how much of it is based on my life. This book is very personal to me. I think a lot of authors' debut novels are quite personal. I did not lose any family members on 9/11, but I did work in an office on Wall Street. And on that day, our building was evacuated. And when I went down to the corner of Wall and Broadway, which, if you know the area, is very close to the Twin Towers, you could see it from there. My friend who had just moved to the city, she'd only been there for 2 weeks. We were trying to figure out what to do. There was chaos everywhere. She didn't know the city. So I grabbed her and I said, okay, we're going to go to Staten Island. That's where my parents live. And the Staten Island ferry is also, that's very close. It's a 10-minute walk. It's all very close together. So we joined this wave of people, hundreds of people running down Broadway. towards the ferry terminal and towards the edges of Manhattan. And when we got to the ferry terminal, within a few moments is when the towers collapsed and the building vibrated, and there was the crowd sort of fell silent. It was like a really eerie silence, and there was a sound that I just will never forget. That was inhuman. And the most frightening part was the ferry terminal had these 2-story windows, these huge windows so that you could see all of Manhattan, and everything went black because of the cloud. And at that point, none of us knew what was actually happening. So we didn't know if the city was gone. We didn't know if it was a bomb. We didn't know what it was, but you couldn't see anything. We got onto the ferry, and there were people covered in ash. There were people trembling and crying, people who had obviously gotten caught in the wave or who had escaped the buildings. And again, there was an eerie silence. There were hundreds of people on the ferry. It was very quiet. People started putting on life jackets, which in all my decades of riding the Staten Island ferry, I had never seen anyone do before. And then in the days, and we made it to my parents' house. My parents are very different to Gigi's parents, but they did sort of do those unreal things. They did sort of eat sandwiches and watch TV because they just didn't know what else to do. It was a very strange time to feel like the world was ending, but that we were still safe in our house. In the days and weeks and months that followed, like millions of New Yorkers, we all felt a collective trauma and a communal loss, and that grief was really palpable. I remember very clearly the first few days riding the subway after everything had happened, and how bleak and sad and empty New York felt. For me, I was a highly anxious child, so I always had dealt with anxiety. And I think anyone had any kind of mental health issue, when you go through an event like that, it really exacerbates it. So I still have trouble around big crowds. When I go into public places, I unconsciously do this. I catch myself doing it. I look for exits. I look for ways to escape, because the imprint of needing to escape was so profound for me. So that was my experience on that day, and life moved on. We flash forward 15 years later, and I was married and living in London, and I had 2 kids, and they were 3 and 5 at the time. I was a lawyer, and I had taken some time off after the birth of my second child, and I had been out of work for 3 years. And I started interviewing, and I kept getting turned down. I couldn't get hired. As soon as I started talking about my childcare needs, that sort of turned employers off. So I was at a real personal crossroads. I felt like my career was over. I was really steeped in motherhood, and I felt really trapped by it. And I wanted to work, but I couldn't get hired. I didn't know how I was going to get out again. So that's the point at which my husband said to me, well, you should write. You should think about that. You should take a class, see if you can do it. And I had never thought about writing before. I'm not one of those people who had wanted to write a novel my whole life. I thought it sounded crazy. I thought it sounded like, you should audition to be on Broadway. Like the chances of getting published are so slim. So it felt kind of crazy to me. But one morning, when my younger son was asleep and my older son was at nursery school, I just put down the laundry, and I said, forget it. And just forget the house and forget what's going to be for dinner, and just see if you can do it. See if you can write something. So I didn't have a book, and I didn't have a plan. I didn't have any characters. I just sat down, and the first thing that came out onto the page was the scene in the book where Gigi sees the paper flying by her office window. And that's her first clue that something's very wrong, that something has happened. And that is based on my own memory of being in my own office and seeing reams of paper flying by. I was on the 8th floor, and it seemed very, very strange. And that was my first indication that something has happened. The air has changed, something has happened. So I never set out to write a book about 9/11. It wasn't my intent to ever do this, but clearly that event, I held it so closely that that's what wanted to come out on the page. So later on that year, I did take a writing class and I learned about novels, and I wanted to write a story that people were going to connect to. I wanted it to feel authentic. I wanted to reach people and talk about things that I had felt and been through, and maybe particularly women, maybe they had been through it and felt it too. And what kept coming out on the page was 9/11 and childbirth, which were two of the most difficult but most important experiences of my life. So I think what that tells you is that writers fall into two camps. You have writers who they will plot and plan and come up with timelines and backstories, and they've got loads of index cards, and they can tell you what's going to happen on, you know, what page. And that's a real skill, and I really admire that. But that is not me. I'm in the other camp. And I think of us as mediums, actually. So that what happens is we invent characters, and then the characters sort of inhabit you, and then they tell you what's going to happen. So no amount of planning works, because you sort of channel this being, even though you invented them, you channel this being, and then they tell you where to go, and you don't really have a choice. You have to do what they tell you. And it really is an out-of-body experience. It's a really bizarre way to work, but it is actually how it feels. It's not very efficient either. I wish that I plotted and planned. It would make things much easier. But I think part of the reason why I wrote that way is because in this writing class that I was in, I had 7,000 words due every month that were then going to be critiqued by my peers. And at the time, I was a stay-at-home mom. I didn't have family nearby. I didn't have a nanny. I didn't have a cleaner. My husband worked really long hours. It was just me and these two kids. I didn't have the headspace, and I didn't have the time. But I really didn't want the children to be an excuse for me not showing up to class or for me not getting my words in. So I had Gigi. I didn't have time for plots or plans or outlines or narrative arcs or any of those things. I just had her, and I would just write whatever she told me to write. And that's how I got through the class. And I just figured I'm going to do what she says. And then when we get to the end, we'll figure out the structure of the book. It'll all come together. But when 9/11 kept coming up as something that she wanted to talk about, I thought about that really, really carefully, about whether or not I should include that, and whether that it was okay to put that in the book, and is it okay to make it part of fiction? Because I know how closely people hold that event. I'm still deeply affected by it. I didn't even lose a family member. I know people who did lose family members, how deeply they are still affected by it. And I think as a writer, especially if you're writing fiction, you have to be so careful with these types of events and treating them gently and with respect. So I was of two minds about whether I should use this as a piece of fiction. But there were other things that I loved about it. I loved that, it was about New York, and I wanted to pay tribute to New York. I haven't lived there for 14 years now, and I miss it. My heart is there. I wanted to pay tribute to Staten Island. It is a very underrated borough. It's a place that I love. I think it's fascinating. There should be more books set on Staten Island. It's a really interesting place. And also, part of 9/11 that I don't think people know much about is the water rescue that happened on that day. It wasn't just the Staten Island ferry. There were tugboats, there were sailboats, there was the New Jersey Transit ferries. There were so many boats that came from New York Harbor to literally pull people off the edge of Manhattan. And I've seen some of that footage and some photographs, because like I said before, because none of us who were caught up in it knew what was actually happening, whether this was a war, was it a bomb, what was going on. people were so terrified that they had nowhere to go, and they had literally pushed up against the barriers in Battery Park. And captains of these boats, however big or small, kept coming back and pulling people off the edge of Manhattan and rescuing them. And I don't think people realize how many people were gotten to safety that way, and how brave all of those captains were in continually coming back, even when they didn't know what the danger was. So I wanted to give that part of the story a tribute, and give maybe a different perspective, one that we weren't used to seeing when we talk about 9/11. So it felt important to write about it. But as I say, I wanted to make sure that I was really careful with how I did that. So I did not interview anyone, and I did not read anyone's personal account of 9/11 until after I had written my whole story. Because what I think is very important when you're writing about any traumatic experience, is not to, even if it's inadvertently, even if it's unconsciously, not to take anyone else's trauma and put it into your fiction, not to capitalize off of someone else's grief. I went back and I looked at these other personal stories to kind of fact check my own, to make sure my details were plausible, to make sure that what I had fictionalized could have actually happened. But I really, really didn't want to inadvertently somehow take someone's family member, or unconsciously take some family's grief and put that on the page. So I think I think fiction writers, I think you can write about almost anything, but I think you do have to treat it really, really carefully, and to think about the real people who were affected and how they would feel if they read what you wrote. I think that's a really important thing to do. Another thing that I did is I gave my manuscripts to tons of people to read. And Stephen King says that he only gives his manuscripts to his wife, and that she's the only person who ever sees it. And that's fine, because, you know, he's Stephen King and he sells millions and millions of books. But I thought it was really important to have other people see what I had written, because other people catch things that you don't see when you're the writer. And particularly in handling 9/11, I wanted to make sure that I had as many people read it as possible, to make sure that that it was respectful and that it felt safe. And I was nervous about that, but I've had some very nice messages from people who either lost someone, or who were involved in the chaos in that day, or who were reminded of it. And it's been very moving to connect with people that way. So through a fictional story, to connect with people and to know that they've been affected and that they feel it, that's been a really remarkable part of this process. And I think another thing about using 9/11 in this story is that it was a really good vehicle for talking about grief in general. Grief is not a one-time event. And I think Gigi really showed us that. I think it's really fascinating that the body can remember, physically can have memories of traumas that we've experienced, that you can feel them at different times of year. So what we see with Gigi is that it's not just the day itself that affects her. It's hot days in the summer that she can remember when he was still alive. It's August 30th and September 5th. It's all the weeks around that time that still affect her. And I think that that's how grief works for a lot of people. And I think it's important to remember that, because I think one of the hardest parts of grief is after it, the initial loss, people forget that you are still grieving, and that you may be grieving for many years after that. And I think it's one of the hardest things is when you feel like you're alone in that grief, which is part of what happens between Gigi and Harry. He doesn't acknowledge what she's going through because he's working and they've got the two kids and life gets really busy, and he doesn't even see that she's in that grieving process. So I think it's really important, and I hope that readers, I hope it reminds them to check on people in their lives who are walking with grief, and to make sure that they're okay, even if it's been many years, because we remember things in different ways. Gigi's story, really, she really helped me at a very low time in my life. And over these past months, I've heard from a lot of readers that she has also affected them in other ways. And whether that's in talking about motherhood or talking about how difficult it is to work when you have a family, or whether it's about isolation of her as a foreigner, or whether it's about grief. It's been really nice to connect with people this way. Like the best part of writing a book really is putting it out into the universe and then finding out that there's like lots of people out there who really love stories and who really want to talk about them. And it's amazing how our lives can be very different. We can all be doing very different things, but there are some human threads that really do connect us. And it's been a wonderful surprise to find those threads with my readers. So that's the story of how that came about. And I'm really happy to take any questions or talk about any other parts of the book.
I have a question based on something you just said. You were obviously, well, one of the things I loved about the book was the opening part about 9/11, because I was in the city and was there in a different part of the city, and couldn't get home until 10 p.m. And it was a very frightening time. But you portrayed it beautifully. I thought it was really beautifully done. And also the normalcy that they saw, her parents sought, drinking tea and eating sandwiches and that kind of thing was pretty incredible. So you're very respectful about 9/11, and I think rightfully so, and you do it very well. Also write a great deal about depression and postpartum depression. And I wonder how you approached that, because it too is a very personal thing. It affects people differently and with a different range of intensity, depending on the person who gave birth and depending on what's going on in life. So how did you feel about that when you were writing about that?
Yeah. So similarly to 9/11, so it's partly based on personal experience. So I have two boys, and they were both born by emergency C-section. So they were both born in tough circumstances. And I did not recover very well, mentally in particular. I found it really, really tough. But I found that experience very isolating. And I found a lot of the emotions that came with it, we don't talk about them. And I think mothers are shamed. And I think that if you're having unmotherly feelings, that if you feel sad around your children, or if you feel angry, or if you have maternal rage at some point, or if you feel like you're falling apart, we have very few outlets in which to express that, because it comes hand in hand with fear of being judged, fear of people thinking that we can't do it or thinking that we're bad parents, fear of people reporting us, fear of teachers finding out. Just there's shame and there's fear. And when I was going through that period when my kids were very small, I couldn't breastfeed my kids, so I pumped around the clock. I did that for a couple months just so they could have some breast milk. And when I would pump in the middle of the night, I would read books. That was the only chance I had to do it. And I kept looking for the book. Where is the book about the woman who had the terrible C-section and who's not bouncing back and who can't breastfeed her children? Because I kept coming across books that were, okay, maybe she did have a C-section. Maybe we actually mentioned that, but breastfeeding is what saved her, and that's what connects them and bonds them. And I thought, well, okay, but where's the woman who didn't have that experience, and why can't I find her? And can someone tell me the story, because I'm having a really, really hard time. So I talked with my husband a lot about how much I should reveal and how much I should share or base the story on what happened to us. And the birth scenes in there and the depression in there, it's kind of an amalgam of things. It's not fully based on my life, but it's certainly, the emotions are real. It may not be the events, but the emotions are real. And I felt like it's a very important story to tell. And I think that we're seeing a trend in fiction now of mothers writing about motherhood in very honest ways. sometimes in ways that frighten people. But I think it's really important to do that because early motherhood especially can be so isolating. And if it's not working well for you, it can be even more so. So I felt like if I was going to do this, if I was going to write about this mother, then I wanted to tell a real story. And I've been really overwhelmed by the messages that I get from mothers, new mothers, and mothers whose children are grown, about connecting to that piece of it, about seeing themselves reflected. So I'm really happy that I've done that. It was quite hard to write at first, but I think, as with anything that you write, once it's down on the page, you get a sort of distance from it. It doesn't really belong to you anymore. It belongs to your readers. So I feel okay about it now. I'm glad that I portrayed her that way. And I think we need more mothers in fiction and on TV who are like her.
I'm a little amazed. And so this was your first foray into writing?
Yeah.
And you were able to, you sent your manuscript out to publishers and someone picked it up? I mean, you're being published by a major publisher.
No.
Right? That's
Yeah.
pretty amazing.
Yeah, I still can't believe it myself. Yeah, so I took a writing class and I spent a year doing that. And then I did everything with timelines because I knew how slim the chances are of getting picked up. So I was very strict. I didn't want to be writing a book for 10 years. I couldn't afford to do that. I needed, if I was going to do this, and it needed to make sense, and it needed to make sense for my family. So I gave myself timelines. I gave myself the year to do the class, and then I gave myself another sort of 6 months to edit. I hired an editor who helped me whip the manuscript into shape. And then I gave myself 6 months to find an agent. Finding the agent is really the tough part. They get 100 manuscripts a week. Finding someone is so hard. And that's the big win, because they find you the publisher. It's getting the agent to get you to the publisher. That's a really hard bit. But I got a piece of advice that was really, really important. I had gone to a bunch of events, like speed dating events with agents, where you pitch yourself. You get 5 minutes to pitch yourself, and they sort of turn you down at the table. And those are horrifying events. They're terrible. But I had gone to one of these, and someone picked up, they said they were interested. They wanted to see the full manuscript. And then a friend of mine said, well, if someone has said that to you, then you need to go back to every agent who you haven't heard from yet and tell them, look, someone's interested in me. Maybe you'd be interested in me too. I sent you this a while ago. And that's actually how I found my agent. She didn't know she had my manuscript, but when I told her, look, somebody over here is interested in me, maybe you're interested in me too, I sent it to her again, and she read it. And then over that weekend, she offered me representation. So had my friend not given me that crucial piece of advice, I wouldn't have found my agent. And I was lucky that happened 2 weeks before the deadline I had given myself. So I think a lot of pieces fell into place at the right time. So I'm lucky in that way. But yes, it is the publishing world is brutal. It's a brutal, brutal place to be. And, just because you get that yes doesn't mean that you continue to get yeses. I get turned down all of the time. I pitch articles all the time. They're turned down. Everything's turned down all the time. I just pitched a new novel to my agent. She was like, no, that's not going to work. So it just doesn't, So like you get the one win and that's great. But like, you have to keep going. It's a tough industry.
So you are writing again, and so they didn't like your second, whatever it was?
No, so I've got so my second book that is coming out in the UK in June. I don't know yet in the US if it's going to be picked up, but my second book is coming out in the UK. And so it's book number 3, because I had a 2-book deal here. So book number 3 is the one that I'm trying to pull together. So we'll see what happens. I think, did you have a question? Sorry.
Yes, well, I was going to say that one of the aspects of the book that I really liked was the fact that it was so generalizable, however you say that correctly, because to me it was less about 9/11 and more about the dysfunctional relationship with the parents.
Yeah.
Her being pulled away from her support system, her girlfriends in the US, and being isolated with people in a different culture. Of course, the grief process. To me, it was really more about that. And it wasn't until she was not reintroduced, because she'd stayed in contact with her girlfriends, but it wasn't until they kind of came to her rescue that she kind of snapped out of it.
Yeah.
So I thought it was important to show how important those relationships were to her. They can do what, quite frankly, a husband can't.
Yeah, it's very true. It's very true that female.
But I also think that one of the reasons why she snapped out of it also was that she got so effing angry. She walks out. Who walks out on two little kids? Somebody who is so filled with rage, she's afraid she's going to pick them up and snap them in two. And the fact that she acted on that anger, I thought was very important to help her start stepping out of the depression. That was, to me, that was very impressive. I mean, who wants to spend a day in a hot sheets motel drinking really bad red wine and watching, of all things? I never appreciated the Housewives series until you wrote that thing. That was hysterical. That was very, but it was because she did that she was finally, first people really reached out, and then she finally said, all right, you can help me. But I think just the release of that rage and just not answering her husband, not answering anybody, and just spending the day doing what she did was a big part of her recovery.
Yeah.
And enabling her to ask for help from her friends.
I think that's.
I love the structure of the book, by the way. I just love how you get this blow by blow, minute by minute picture of her disintegrating in this sordid motel room, interspersed with all of these really nice long chapters about the history of what's going on, what's happened in her life, and what's happened in her marriage. The structure is really very compelling, really nice. Did you start with that, or did somebody say, hey, you got to revamp this and bring it alive, which I have heard, you got to revamp? Or was that yours? Did you start with it?
No. So when the first draft, there was no hotel. It was just a series of scenes from the life of this mother. And then when I started working with my teacher, he said, okay, but you can't, like, none of these scenes go together. Like, there has to be something that knits them together. And of course, this is where an outline would have been very helpful, which is, if you are able to outline and plot, just do it, because I had to then go backwards and figure out a way to tie together all these different scenes of motherhood. And then that's where the idea of the hotel and running away, because what does every woman want to do but just flee her house, even if it's just for a few hours, to just stare at a wall, just whatever it is. I think that's an idea that people really relate to as well. So then I had to kind of rework it into a structure. So I didn't have a structure, which the only thing that I did was, because I had these words due every month, I would give myself a prompt, and I would say, okay, something like coffee or wine or tea, or all the chapter names. I would give myself that liquid or that substance, and I would say, okay, write a scene about motherhood and incorporate this liquid. That was the only structure that I had. So those chapter names stayed, which is cool, but that's not a good way to write a book. I mean, that's really, it was hard work to then go back and create a narrative. And so I don't write, my second book, I did not write that way, because it is not very efficient. But yeah, that is something that came in later. The same thing with her friends. And I'm glad that you picked up on that and on their role, because it's a really important role. And them coming in like a Greek chorus That was another thing that also came in, because how was I going to get her through this day? She's got this one day in the hotel room. How am I going to get her through it? Well, we all know the power of that female friendship, just like you were saying, and how vital that is. But what do you do in a situation where they're not there? You're far apart from them, and all you have is text messages. I think we all, in this world that we're in, you can hide so much in those text messages. They were suspicious that something was going on with her, but she kept deleting what was real, and just smoothing it over, because it felt like that wasn't the time or the place to be able to express what she was feeling. So all of those elements sort of came together in the drafts after the initial one, because there was so much to, a woman who's in this situation, like you say, who's this enraged. We needed the people to somehow get to her, and it took them a long time. But she also had to be in a place ready to accept their help, and that's very hard. I think we've all known people in our lives who they're in a low place. It's really hard to help people who won't accept help. But thankfully, she gets there in the end.
And how we're all impacted by how we're raised, and because her relationship with her mother was one that probably was not the healthiest.
No.
That was kind of the foundation, and then everything else got piled on the top of that over the years, which just caused her to go into that feud.
And there's also that thing of, I think everyone has that moment where there are these things your mother does where you're like, I'm never going to do that. I'm never going to do that. I'm never going to do that. And then you wake up one day and you are doing them all the time. And unfortunately, in Gigi's case, her mother's behavior so emotionally shut down and so locked up. Gigi fights that all the time, like trying to break out of it. But it took her a really long time to do that, to break that behavior.
Mm-hmm.
I have to be honest. I'm glad everybody's talking about this, about, well, my mom did this or my mom did that. I called my son, the one that I have a couple of sons, but the one that I am most in contact with, that I see on a regular basis, because my 3 sons are grown and married and in the military. And I asked him a lot of questions just from this story. And the piece that I got out of it is he remembers that day, and he was young, and he remembers me taking him out of school, and he remembers being able to see the burning buildings from the overpass of the highway. But then fast forward, and he became an electrician, and he went through an apprenticeship. And for the 5 years of his apprenticeship, he worked on building the Freedom Tower. And he said, to have that as a child, to be able to see what was happening, but then to be a part of the rebuild, he said it was the most peaceful job site. He's been on the job now 10 years, but that was the most peaceful job site he was ever at. He said there was nothing eerie about it. There was nothing scary about it. And he said it was really comforting. But from what Gigi was going through, I called him and I said, how was I? Like, really, give me the truth, because I have 2 generations of children. And when you have, my oldest is 32 and then 29 and then 26 and then a 14-year-old, I wanted the inside scoop to say, hey, tell me the truth. I did. And my youngest was an emergency C-section in the middle of the night. And I had 3 teenage sons at home and my husband. And so I really wanted to know how was I? They were all, I think they were being pleasantly polite to me. But what a book. And thank you, because it was wonderfully written. Again, I agree. I loved all the backstory.
Thank you. That's really nice to hear. Thank you.
I also like how you outlined, you didn't talk about it, you didn't write about it, but you showed class differences, even in perception, even in what you see and what you don't see. And it is, I kind of lived through it myself, and it is, I thought you did a really fine job of doing that. I really, the day of 9/11, I really wanted to continue liking him. But man, up until the day of her break, I wanted to hold his head underwater. It was kind of like, oh, come on. Can you not see what is happening in front of you, about so many things? And it was a little disturbing. He was my least favorite character, even though her mother was by far the nastiest and probably the most destructive in her own depression, just dragging down everyone around her.
Yeah. Sorry, did you say Harry was your least favorite? Sorry, you broke up a bit.
I think, yeah, I'm sorry. Yes, Harry was my least favorite, in part because I have been very lucky. I didn't get married until later, and I lucked into a man who was actually an equal partner. These ridiculous, and pardon me if I offend anybody, but that ridiculous book, Lean In, you read that and you think, well, where are you living and where are you finding these guys? Because no one I know is married to somebody like that equal partner, except I lucked into it. And it is impossible to do. It's not impossible. It's just, I don't know how women aren't angry every day if they're living with somebody who doesn't take on half of the burden and who doesn't see what needs to be done.
Yeah.
I don't know how that happens.
Yeah.
And I thought you portrayed that really well. Instead, he was frustrated. He loves her. He didn't want to see her suffering, but he was pissed off because she was not forthcoming with him, etc. Instead of seeing that depression means you can't talk.
Yeah.
You cannot
And
talk.
I think part of his difficulty in seeing that and understanding that was also cultural, because the way that mental health still to today is discussed and handled in the British culture is very, very different to how we handle it as Americans. It's changing now, but people are not forthcoming about their situations, emotions. This is still a very generally buttoned up, stiff upper lip kind of culture, which was part of what I wanted to explore, which is what I wanted to do with Gigi, is to explore how, coming from a culture in which we are very open and talking about our difficulties and differences, and moving to a different health system and moving to a different culture where people are not open about emotion at all. So that was one thing that I wanted to explore. Another thing is I do think it's very common. I think lots of marriages experience the kinds of inequality that Gigi and Harry have, but it's not so much inequality as it is just seeing the same situation from two very different perspectives, and one person viewing everything that needs to be done, and the other person just simply not seeing it, and the other person not knowing that they don't see it, and then this person over here who does see it getting really frustrated that this person over here is not reading their mind and can't see the thing that they're frustrated about. So I think that happens in a lot of marriages. But I also think what happens, particularly for women who've had difficult births, I think that if their partner is male, for many men, I think it is the first time where they feel truly powerless when they watch someone who they love giving birth, particularly if the birth is going badly. They are incapable of helping. They can't get involved. They're terrified. They feel like they're supposed to be protecting this woman and they don't know if she's going to live or die. I think that it is, for a lot of men, because of the way that they're raised, the first time that they actually feel very vulnerable and powerless and incapable of doing anything. And I think it's a very male response, generally, to mask that by acting like everything's fine, rather than saying, do you know what? It was actually really terrifying and I thought I was going to lose you and I didn't know what to do. And I think that many men feel quite powerless. And then when the baby is home, and obviously the mother has to do so much of the caretaking, they don't know how to help. They feel useless. And rather than saying, I don't know how to help and I don't know what to do for you, they pull away. I think that happens in a lot of marriages. So that's something that I wanted to do with Harry, is to show that because we know from the 9/11 chapter that he is a very loving, very thoughtful, very empathetic person, and he knew what to do for her family. And even when they get married, he feels for her mother, even though her mother is awful. He feels for her, so we know he has that in him. But I think that some people, and men in particular, when they're faced with something traumatic, the response is to act like it's not happening and not affecting them, when actually underneath, they're just terrified because they don't know what to do. Harry does not know what to do with her. She's falling apart. He's in a culture where people don't go to therapy, and he has no idea what to do, which is why in front of the midwife, he masks for her. Instead of saying to the midwife, you know what, my wife's in trouble and she needs help, he says, oh, look, the feeding is going fine. Everything we're doing is fine. Everything's fine, fine, fine. And he covers for her. And I think it's kind of a very British response, or that's what I've noticed living here. That's kind of a very British response. So I hear you, though. I know he's frustrating. A lot of women are very frustrated with with Harry and how he behaves. But yeah.
So if you had written this book, if you'd come back to the United States, would we have a different perspective?
That is such a good question. I think it would have been a really different book, because the healthcare system and the way that mothers are treated, just in healthcare alone between the US and UK, is so radically different. So I think that experience would have felt really different. I don't know. The marriage may have been the same because my husband is British. And we have, through our long relationship, kind of had to learn how to deal with each other's cultural clashes. So those parts may have been the same, but I think there are some things that were uniquely British. So like this idea of the community midwife coming into your home, you never have your own obstetrician, all births are midwife led. They try very hard not to have any medical interventions in births. They really try to get people to have natural births. It's like a whole different view of it compared to the US, which is part of why Gigi also feels so dislocated. That was how I felt too. I gave birth to my kids here, and I just tried really hard to get into the system. But we don't recognize, when you're raised in a medical system, how much a part of your understanding of the world that is. And when you're in a completely, like the medical system here is the total opposite of the US, socialized healthcare, your view of the world changes when you're in a different medical system. Your feeling of safety is very different.
How is it different? I'm not saying no, I just, that's a real question. How is it different?
The medical system?
How is your feeling of safety different?
Yeah. Because for me as an American, you're growing up knowing my pediatrician and having the same doctor until I was 18 years old. When I was a student, being able to get free gynecological care on a yearly basis. My mom has a history of breast cancer, mammography, and making sure that you have breast health checks, those things that is constantly drilled into us, women over 40. Make sure that you are doing that. Here in the UK, things are very different. Their approach to healthcare is very much on a need basis, as in what is your actual medical need. So things like mammography that's not routinely given to women until they are close to age 60. Stuff around childbirth was really hard for me because I thought I would have an obstetrician, the same doctor throughout my care. That's what I had expected. And instead I had a series of midwives, never the same one. I never got to know anyone. I had to repeat my medical history all the time because the obstetricians are there for high risk births and for people in high risk categories. So they try to push you through. Everybody sort of makes do. You feel very anonymous in this system. That's not to say it's not a good system. Everyone here is taken care of. Everyone here gets medical care. And that is really, truly miraculous. Nobody here is worried about massive medical bills and about insurance and about not being able to get the care they need. So that is the trade-off, is that everyone here is universally taken care of. But what this means is you don't necessarily know who is taking care of you. And I think when we're raised in a system where you kind of get personalized care, it's very different when you become anonymous, especially dealing with something like being a first-time mother. That felt really frightening to me. I mean, obviously they were going to take care of me, but it would have been a better experience if I had known who they were.
The more the states moves into managed care, the more anonymous it can get. So my sister and I developed 2 different kinds of cancer at the same time, at the same month, almost the same day we were diagnosed. I have been lucky in that I've had virtually the same doctor and the same medical team for the past 5 years. She has seen different doctors, different team members, to the degree where she gets both angry and very depressed. You walk into a doctor's office and somebody picks up your chart, they scan it, they haven't looked at it. She has a very weird kind of breast cancer, and what you described was you don't feel like somebody really knows you. You don't feel like somebody's basically, in some regards, taking care of you. That's what she's experiencing. And I think that some of the medical care in the States is moving that way. Not all of it, but some of it is. It's very different than it was 15 or 20 years ago.
Yeah, it feels different. But it's sort of all part of being a foreigner. When you move to a new country, it's just part of the things that you learn to adapt to. So it's part of the experience. It's part of why I wanted to include it in the book and write about it, because I think for lots of people, when they move to the UK, coming from any number of places, things do feel quite different.
Well, what do you love about living there? You talk about what you miss in New York, but what do you love about living in the UK besides your husband and children?
London is an amazing, amazing city. I don't think people realize, New York is a huge place, but New York is very compact and condensed, and you can get around, you can get around all of Manhattan pretty quickly. London is this massive, sprawling place. And one of the things I love about it is that somebody will invite you to dinner or to see a movie, and I've lived here for 14 years. There are neighborhoods I have never, ever been to, seen, or heard of that are part of London, because this place is just so vast. And everywhere you turn is a very beautiful place. There is just history everywhere. There are castles everywhere. There are beautiful, old, ancient buildings. There are Roman walls. You can feel the weight of history here everywhere that you go, so it's very beautiful. I think British people are hilarious. This is like, and that's part of what I wanted to put into the book too, is that they have a real ability, even when things are very bleak, to make you laugh. I have seen it everywhere. I have seen it in like the darkest situations. If you've got somebody British with you, they will say something funny to lighten the situation. And I think that's a really special thing about this place. And I've loved living here. I've met, when you travel outside into England, that's the other thing that's great about it, is that London is like this big metropolitan place. People from all over the world here. I don't really feel like a foreigner here because everyone is a transient and a foreigner here. There's very few sort of Londoners who have always lived here, but it doesn't take very long, just like 40 minutes outside the city, and England is beautiful. England is a really beautiful, really green. It rains here all the time, but that means that it's extremely green. So it's the countryside here is really beautiful. So it's been very interesting. It's been a really interesting change for me. It's home now, you know, but because I've had my kids here and my family is British, but yeah, there's a lot. If you've never been here, you should definitely come. There's a lot going for it.
What is the name of I assume Penguin is publishing book number 2 as well?
No, so we haven't established that yet. So my second book is called Little Prisons. That is coming out in June 2022 here in the UK with Two Roads, which is Hatchet. And in the US, we don't know yet where it's going to be picked up. Hopefully we'll know that soon. But yeah, that's next year.
Well, that's nice. Congratulations.
Thanks. Yes, I'm excited.
Well, I have to thank Ilona for coming on with us. I mean, now it's 11:30 at night there,
Yeah.
just about. And it has been fascinating. I think that we got a really wonderful look into writing the story. And it was, you know, it was a 9/11 start was the start point, but there was so much more depth to the book, of course. And obviously, your audience has appreciated all the work that you put into it. And, you know, we wish you a lot of luck, and I'll keep an eye open for the next one. Hopefully it'll be here in the United States.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. It was so nice talking with all of you. Thank you so much. Thank you for reading the book. I really, really appreciate that. Thank you.
It was an easy read. Thank you.
It was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So for the book club people, I'll be getting the information about our next author, who is also located in London too. So 2 in a row. And you'll get that information shortly. Thank you again, Ilona. And I did record this. I don't know if we're going to be sharing it. It probably needs to be edited, and I'll let you know. But it was a really fascinating story that you gave us.
Thank you.
Time.
So much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Have a great
Thank
night. We'll see you soon.
Take care.
Okay,
Bye,
thank
guys.
you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Okay,
Take care. Bye-bye.
bye-bye.
Bye.